Matthew, thank you for joining me in conversation today. How are you doing?
Thanks, Natalie. I'm doing really well.
And you are joining us from?
Yeah, from the garden route in South Africa. So on the southern cape of South Africa.
Beautiful. And just before we started recording, you gave me a beautiful shot of your outside view, which is just green and lush and gorgeous.
Yeah, it's very inspiring, and it's definitely a big part of my connection to this place. With that kind of view, for sure.
So, and we are going to explore nature, connection, and belonging as quite a rich theme in this conversation. But before we dive into that, I'd love to ask you how you imagine or sense the global human psyche right now. What's going on there for you if we use that frame?
Cool. It's a big one. I guess I've got two ways of answering that. The first one would be that it's felt like for some time that we're in this idea of the dark night of the soul, that that humanity is really facing a kind of reckoning within itself and with its relationship with one another, and obviously the earth at large. And yeah, I mean that's that's kind of a mythological archetypal idea, but I think many people understand intrinsically what that means, that there's a deeper rising up of something which is maybe beyond our conscious control, but that we have to somehow address. And if we don't, it manifests as conflict, as illness, as a real disharmony. But then on the more, I think, potentially conventional plane is, I just think our human psyche is incredibly fragmented. It's distracted, and I think in many ways it's desensitized. And I guess we might be diving into that a little bit in terms of how that happens and what we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thinking about what it would mean to be flourishing in such uncertain and challenging times, if you think about or sense into the concept of flourishing and what it means to you, how do you begin to explore what that is, especially at this moment, what flourishing is?
Yeah, I mean, my lens for all these sorts of questions are always through the lens of relationship, the lens of connection, and that's with all life. We have a tendency to separate the human and the nature, which needs to be done in some aspects, but it has to be careful that we don't create this sort of false dichotomy. But flourishing for me is when we are in a much more deeper, mindful relationship, with ourselves, with one another, and with nature, with the rest of nature. And I think that also requires a certain way of attending. One of my biggest concerns is with how we're attending to the world, and particularly to the natural environment. And I use this term scroll consciousness to sort of speak that we've entered a way where I believe how we're interacting with the rest of life is almost as if we were scrolling a social media feed. Our ability to give attention to particular issues, to one another, and what I'm particularly concerned about is with the natural world. Is that it's very brief, it's very quick, and there's something about the alchemy of attention that when we can step into that and actually focus in a particular kind of way and listen, then that activates something. And I believe that's part of our flourishing. And there are many other elements which we can speak about later in terms of what are these gateways into deeper connection and deeper relationship with Earth, and that is about finding more meaning, reciprocity, physical contact, beauty, gratitude, sharing. I mean, there are all these factors, and I think we need to have at least a number of those touchstones there in order we can enter into flourishing. It isn't my core expertise, but there are these other factors, in terms of lifestyle habits, whether it's how we breathe, how we move, our social connection, our nutrition. there are so many touchstones, and I think it's important that we're never going to find that silver bullet. And the
Yeah.
answer for each, the answer for each of us is contextual, and it's according to who we are and our journey and where we're at. So yeah, and I think obviously I can give we can give the academic answer on that and all these certain tick boxes. But I think at this point in time, part of that dark night of the soul journey is to tapping in for ourselves to step into, well, what is it that's actually really meaningful to me right now that's going to aid in my flourishing?
So I'm curious to dig a bit deeper into this concept of, well, this, I guess it's a lived experience really, of desensitization. And when we started talking about the global human psyche and the fragmentation and desensitization that you're witnessing there, and then also scroll consciousness, which I suspect is deeply interrelated with this desensitization. Can you talk a bit more about what you mean or what you're seeing in terms of desensitization and what it does to us and to our relationship with the rest of life?
Yes, I think a good place to start with that is just to situate ourselves within our evolutionary history. And if you look at the human timeline, at least, since we became modern Homo sapiens, for 95% of human history, we were living as egalitarian hunter-gatherers. And, for 99.9% of human history, that was before the Industrial Revolution. So it's only this very short period of time, literally the last few minutes, if you condense human history to a 24-hour day, the last couple of minutes, where we've had this existence, which is very different to the way that our body has evolved. So our neurophysiology has certain expectations, it has certain needs, and our consciousness developed in a particular environment. And that environment was obviously to help with our survival. It was to scan for predators, it was to look for food, and it was also, to live in community. And these were small, sort of foraging communities. So what's happening now is actually unlike anything, the conscious has experienced. And whilst we're remarkably adaptable, there are certain, let's say, there are certain costs to that. And, consciousness wouldn't be able to, isn't able to take in every single bit of phenomena. So it has to edit out. And we edit out through these filters and through this intentionality that we need to be able to direct according to phenomena. So in our current urban lives, we are just hammered with inputs. This is this idea of the attention economy, all this stimuli, and it becomes overload. And I think you've actually spoken about this cognitive load. That we cannot do it. So some part of that has to edit out. And so what's going to get edited out? Well, that which is of not immediate relevance to our survival, that which is of not immediate relevance to our social connection or sense of being accepted, within a particular social group. And this starts to happen. And so, inevitably, in order to function, there is some desensitizing coming on. And on the other hand, if you are quite nature connected and you're tuned into global affairs, there's this eco grief as well, which can play out. And it's almost a kind of a sheltering behavior, an adaptation to actually desensitize in order to cope. But one of the interesting things about this idea of super stimuli, and this work came out of well, firstly, I mean, many of your listeners might be aware of Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. They had this invisible gorilla from from about 15 years ago. Where you looked at the screen and this gorilla walks through, and it was it 40-60% of people didn't see it.
Wasn't it a basketball match or something like this? And you've got to watch the player, and then you just don't see the gorilla walk straight through, like the person in the gorilla costume.
Exactly, yeah. So you're counting the passes between the players, and the gorilla walks through. Now, that is incredibly profound for the kind of focus that we're engaged in now, and maybe I'll speak to that more later. But what it also speaks to, is this idea of inattention blindness, and what I would call inattention nature blindness now, that, nature has become a blind spot because it's lost relevance to our everyday lives, particularly when we're in an urban setting. And so we just edit out, we don't notice the phenomena that would have been a part of our experience. And so if it's not forming part of our experience, it's not forming part of our consciousness, because consciousness is a product of our experiences. So we're constantly, rewiring through neural circuits, a particular kind of consciousness, and nature's not featuring in that by and large. And this, and then this more insidious idea of super stimuli, which comes a lot through our tech. And there was this funny research, I think it won the Ig Nobel Prize, which is at the time given to the science, it's sort of meaningless. But there were these researchers in Australia who noticed that the jewel beetle, which is a shiny insect, beetle, were congregating around these beer bottles, the VB beer bottle, stubby, as we call it, those short brown bottles, and they were all over it, and they were trying to understand what's going on here. And what was going on, and they found out, was these beer bottles were pushing all the evolutionary cues in the male jewel beetle,
Wow.
and that it couldn't resist it. It was the ideal female. It had,
Wow, there's
as
so
far
much
as
in
its
that.
exactly, as far as its shininess, its shape, the little ribs and knobs and all that, it just touched the buttons. And what did
Wow.
that say for us now? And the problem was not only were they doing that, it wasn't just like that's where it ended. The problem was they were diverting all their attention to that, and there were all these females who
We're
weren't
waiting around.
waiting around, and so it was affecting their breeding success and all that.
Wow.
So what does that say as a metaphor for us? And are we able to resist the super stimuli? And what's the opportunity cost for our attention when we're not able to do that?
God, that is such an interesting question. It's tricky, isn't it? Because I think one of the things that I encounter a lot with my work, which is increasingly straddling, I feel like, sort of competing worlds or futures, is that on the one hand, we've got this kind of deep need to connect, which technology facilitates. Like this conversation today, there's no way I'd be able to have this conversation at this moment in time with you and learn from you unless we had the tech that we have. So there's this huge potential that we're afforded at this moment in time. And at the same time, the cost, as you say, is high. And one of the themes that comes up a lot, and you hear people like Tristan Harris famously talk about this, is where does the responsibility lie in deciding and choosing how technology impacts our lives socially, psychologically, emotionally, and so on. And to kind of pull back to that super stimuli, if there is something that is designed, and it is designed, the internet at large, driven by ads and by engagement, if it's designed to be so tempting or irresistible, then is it realistic? And I would suggest very much not. Is it realistic to expect individuals to be able to adapt their behaviours in such a way that they're making choices that are better for them? So spending time away from their screens, being able to go out into nature, paying attention to those things that actually give us a deeper sense of eudaimonia, of flourishing, of meaning, of connection. And that's a really big question of our time, because if we believe, as in many individualistic societies, we're kind of prompted to, that the power rests within the agency of the individual, we're looking at a pretty bleak future. If, however, we are able to reclaim this idea that it's through through collective action that we can instigate through individual conversations or individual insights or revelations, if we think about the collective action that we can engage in, that's when extraordinary things can happen. So you can put pressure on people who are in positions of power or in legal profession, whatever it is. You can put pressure in order to get laws changed, to shift the responsibility to the companies that actually are creating the tech that, yes, we rely upon, but we also are potentially impoverished by. Which I know is quite like strong language to use, but I think we really, again, you were talking about reckoning. We have to really think about, what is the kind of society or societies, because it's always going to be pluralistic. What are the societies that will give rise to the flourishing of the most life of our non-human peers? And how does technology work in service to that? And at the moment, I very much think, in large, it doesn't. And yet there are things like your NatureFix app, which I'd love to include into the conversation, because it sits at this kind of really interesting juncture between nature, humanity, and tech. Obviously, we're all interconnected and it all comes from the earth. But if we use those categories to kind of locate ourselves, can you tell us a bit about your experience? Well, first of all, what the NatureFix app is, and some of your experience about navigating these complicated, complex issues.
Yeah, I might start with the second question first, because that leads into
There's a
how
lot of questions in there.
how NatureFix came
Yes.
into being. Yeah, look, I mean, there's there's a huge spectrum of tech, of course,
Yeah.
and there is, I mean, this tech that we're engaging with today is of a very different quality, um, compared to the tech of, which is bombarded with advertising, which is trying to take our attention, encouraging us to scroll, likes, all the rest.
Mm.
Um, I've started to frame this in terms of the um,
Mm.
polyvagal nerve theory in a way, and without going into too much detail around that. But you actually spoke to it yourself, and that's what triggered my thought here, because you know, is the tech um, taking us into fight flight mode? And so, with our emotional regulation system, we have the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, mediated by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and what have you. But a lot of our day-to-day existence now is, really being hit in the sympathetic nervous system, and we're getting these dopamine,
Mm-hmm.
these little dopamine lollies that are taking us there. Now, I mean, dopamine and the activation of attention and all that is part of our existence. I mean, we need that to to hunt, to forage. That's part of it. But what was always in that was there was the rest and digest, the parasympathetic, the time of coming into community, to sitting around the fire,
Mm.
to just being still, sitting under a tree after lunch, after you've hunted. I mean, that was there. And so basically, our society is the equivalent of running from predators or being scared about predators or
Mm.
threats. With all the fear, the uncertainty, or being on this sort of short little reward mechanism of, oh well, there's a berry, there's a berry, there's a berry, and some sort of validation, and not wanting to be kicked out of our tribe. Which has also become a feature. So, the point is, this sympathetic nervous system is activated, and there's a whole lot of effects that happens in terms of our neurochemistry, and I won't go into that now. But what you spoke to was social engagement, and a big
Mm.
part of being human, a big part of our brain development with the frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex, was the inhibition idea. And I mean, Ian McGilchrist speaks a lot about this, but also the idea that we can choose, through working through that mechanism, to um, to decouple the fear. They don't have to run with it. We can actually step into to engagement, and social engagement is a big way of doing that. So when you can't socially engage, it's very hard to get out of the fight, flight, freeze, or forward cycle, and engagement. And so much of the focus of this polyvagal work, from the likes of Stephen Porges and Peter Levine and stuff, I mean, they look at the social engagement, but I would 100% place in there the eco-social engagement. What's the natural engagement there? Because all the research we're looking at on nature connection and being in nature also has similar outcomes from the social engagement, in terms of being more grounded, being more in the present, curiosity, openness, compassion, being mindful, and eudaimonic well-being. And nature connection has been found to be a far bigger predictor for eudaimonic well-being than even socioeconomic status. That was from a study out of the UK. So when we came to NatureFix, there are a lot of things around that. There's a lot of research being done on nature connection, and that is different from nature contact. As we say, that it's not just contact with nature, it's the nature of the contact. So it's important to be in an environment, but what you do there is just as important. And neuroscience has looked at that as well. You can have a wonderful environment, but if you're not putting in the effort, you're not going to get the outcomes. And sometimes you need to be guided to make that effort. We can get caught up in our own sensory ruts, our own rumination, and we just don't notice. So a big part of nature connection is the noticing, and it's a worldview. It's about embodied experience, and it's this place-based relationship, that we have, where there's these symbiotic thoughts, feelings, and emotions that really reflect in actions that we're a part of nature, that we have a relationship with the rest of nature. And there's a growing body of research showing the power of nature connection for human health and for planetary health, in terms of motivating pro-conservation, pro-social behaviours. So with NatureFix, we said, well, how can we make this more accessible? At the moment, or previously, you may need to have a forest bathing guide, some sort of other experience, and it's not always accessible, and it's not always achievable, and it's not always appropriate, And so what we were doing, and it really gained momentum, during the COVID era, where we would have green space managers, park managers, who would want to be doing more for their constituents, for their citizens. And so it started with signage in parks, encouraging people to do exercises that was related to breathing, opening their senses. And it started with a few. Now we've written about 60 activities, and we're constantly writing these new routines, as we call them. And it's moved to an app. And that was a big step for us. And hang on, we're going to move to an app. But it became a natural step. And we were very lucky to work with an IT developer who had also come to a point in his life where he'd saw that many of the things he'd worked on, if he took it from the genesis, which might have seemed to have been well-intended, and he followed it through its trajectory, at the end, he started to say, well, did it really serve the greater good? Did it really serve society, or what have you? And so he became far more mindful as to, okay, how can I really engage technology to do that? And so what NatureFix is doing is really trying to encourage engagement. So we developed these wellness trails where you can geolocate a pin, and then the app will pick that up in a certain trail, and then you can listen to an audio of an exercise that that encourages you to slow down and to notice. And it's geolocated. You could also use a QR code, and you can read off your screen if you want to, but the idea is that the option is there, that you can just put in one earbud, or you can listen on speakerphone in an area and just have somebody guide you through that. And there are benefits there which we didn't realize at the time, because sometimes these experiences, when they're guided with a person, so I am in favor of person-guided experiences. I mean, that's what we still encourage. We like the social connection. But for a doctor I spoke to, he said, sometimes if I want to encourage a person to go on these experiences, I'm not sure what the guide's going to be like. I have to have trust in the guide. If you've had an uncomfortable experience with a particular individual, of a particular demographic, and that's who your guide represents, I mean, the projection there could undermine the whole experience, And so, there are elements of feeling safe and feeling comfortable. Nature connection, only really works when people feel safe and comfortable to begin with, and then you can move the edges after that. Yeah, so, I mean, NatureFix has really stepped in there, and now we're working with hospitals, we're working with universities on campus. We've been dealing with a conservation organisation who had their members suffering from eco-anxiety, eco-grief. So we had a 28-day program to work with Nature Connection, because Nature Connection also builds resilience in the face of stresses. So sometimes in the conservation mode of okay, we've got to save the planet every day, and then there's so much going on that you don't actually have the time to reconnect with the very reason that you got into why you're doing what you're doing, and that's also. So, I mean, I could talk more about that, but that's just it in a nutshell at the moment. Yeah.
There's so much to unpack there. I'm not sure where to go next. Okay, somewhere that I'm interested to explore next is this question around safety and being in a receptive enough space, or moving into a receptive enough space where you can open up and maybe, lower your heart rate a little bit, deepen your breath, feel your feet on the ground, and feel a sense of physically coming home to yourself. So you're not just up in your mind thinking. I definitely spend a lot of time up in my mind thinking, and going out and being, actually for me, it's kind of like going to the local forest and then walking uphill quite a bit and getting a sweat on. That actually brings me down much quicker than sitting and doing some breathing. Anyway, there's lots of routes in, but I'm curious about the ways in which we access some of these other states through nature connection, like awe and this kind of late 1800s idea of the sublime, of the individual being so tiny and insignificant in the face of the vastness of nature and the cosmos. And there is something to that wild edge which is threatening. And because it's threatening to our sense of significance and self-importance, it's also potentially extraordinarily liberating, especially when many of us in industrialized countries in particular, living with this kind of, I don't know, this kind of frame that we are all important and we can save the world. And I don't think there's a blame thing here. It's just, and I have this too. It's like, I've got to be doing meaningful work. And if I don't, then X, Y, and Z will happen. And so I guess the question I'm asking is, how do we, once people have that sense of safety and they can open up, how do we help people to engage with the wilder, more threatening, raw quality of the plurality of nature? Because that's also part of it. And I think it also connects with our own, like the shadow aspects that we hold that we perhaps don't want to admit to ourselves that we have, like in this civilized society where we've relinquished so much in order to have safety and a roof over our heads. So I don't know, there's a lot in there. I'm kind of curious to see where you take that.
Yeah. You mentioned the word awe, and just heard the other day Dr. Keltner from University of Berkeley, I believe, with his Greater Good Science Centre, and he's done a lot of research on awe with his team. And there was a Guardian article which quoted, just interviewing him, and if they got it right, which I guess they did, that he said that they did a survey of 300,000 people across 26 countries, which seems extraordinarily huge sample size. And he said none of them reported experiencing awe on their smartphone. I thought that was just an interesting lead in. But yeah, so my doctorate research was on meaningful nature experiences. And I mean, that's really, it is a huge question. And there are, some of the biggest barriers for getting into that, and a sense of meaning and wonder and awe and humility are, of course, fear, access, the perception of safety, comfort level. And yeah, because we have this enculturated captivity, Vaughan Elgins uses the word zoochosis, an enculturated captivity, that he was looking at zoo animals and watching how they behave, and saying that actually humans also have this same phenomenon going on, particularly, and I would say particularly with the attention, but even with our behaviours, we act in this way. So it's interesting when we do head out into these wilder spaces. Well, I mean, for a start, some of the work we're talking about in these day-to-day nature connection practices, I mean, it's really a form of enrichment, and that's what you do for animals. You give them enrichment, captive animals. And then the wild spaces, you go out there, and if you release an animal that's been captive for a long time or has been in rehab for a long time, and you go into a wilder space, there's this like, what do I do now? I mean, throw open the door of a party with a whole lot of unfamiliar faces, and what do? You just stand there, so there's that's always going to be met. And that's why for many of these experiences, it's great to be guided in those places. But there is something about tapping into, I mean, the very word bewildered, obviously comes, from wild, and I've actually got a program that I call that, because, the wild was always disorienting. The wild post-agricultural, sort of 6,000 years ago was sort of fenced out and out of there. And so there can be inherent fears and what have you. But a lot of that also comes with, as you increase your knowledge with place and your connection and relationship with a particular place, you start to really understand those fears. Well, is it really a fear grounded in, grounded in basis? Am I going to get chomped as soon as I exit my door? Am I going to get stung? Am I going to get bitten? And I mean, that's the part of the process of connecting, is that a lot of those hazards, those risks, those perceived hazards and risks start to become far more mitigated. And I was on a program the other week where someone rocked up with very little experience in nature, very urban. And when we were going through the hazards and risks, I mean, she was completely frightened about the possibility of snakes. But then over the weekend, when we're all sitting outside, we're gathering around a fire, work's being done. I mean, that just, you can see it. I mean, it no longer entered the psyche. And by the end, when we're joking about it, she's laughing with it, compared to in the beginning when she was really like, what? That's a possibility. So, yeah. there is something about entering in the wilder spaces that brings up this opportunity for encounters with the other, the animal other, the tree other, the plant other, the fungi other, and I mean there is rich metaphor in nature which speaks to a remembering. It invites a remembering of our lost relationship, with the earth. And I mean, that's, I analysed over 200 accounts of meaningful nature experiences, and there's no one size fits all. On my website, and we can put the link in there, I do give a rich description where I try to capture some of the biggest themes as to what are the triggers. Often the proximity with an animal, the time that one has in that space, a sense of shared awareness, reciprocity, eye contact, a sense of communing, or if it's with landscape, vastness, vibrancy, attention to detail. Something in the stream of consciousness has shifted. Something has broken the homeostasis and given us an insight which we wouldn't normally have on our day-to-day experience. And just on that, we have to avoid the hubris in Western culture that our mode of consciousness is baseline. The work of Joseph Heinrich and colleagues a decade ago, he had this acronym WEIRD, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and he said democratic, although let's just say distracted now.
Yes, distracted is probably more appropriate.
What they found was a lot of our research in psychology and in neuroscience was done on Western subjects, often middle-class American undergrads, it's even worse. And then it was generalized, it was universalized. And it's clear when they were looking at perceptual tests, how long is a piece, how long are these two arrows with, hard for me to describe. But I mean, the Sand Bushman, would see, that these particular arrows were the same length far quicker than the US undergraduate. So, what is the baseline for our perceptual experience? And we need to constantly come back to that and just realize that what we're seeing is not what everyone else is seeing. And that also is going to affect the richness of our nature experiences.
So interesting. I recently finished reading, my partner got me a copy of The Journey to Ecology by Carlos Castaneda. And it was written in the 60s. And in it, there's debate as to whether it's fictional or non-fictional, but in it, the idea is that the protagonist, Carlos, is writing from his perspective when he meets someone in Mexico who is, he describes himself as a sorcerer and who has a great interconnection with nature. And one of the passages that really struck me, and it's a mesmerizing book, is when there's a description of the ways in which the paying of attention can shape fundamentally what you see within your surroundings. So two things that come to mind that really struck me, and he describes it beautifully, is at this juncture of where there's a rock standing and where the rock meets the earth, and there's a shadow that's cast on the earth, and the ways in which, to a perhaps more westernized mind, the shadow is of course cast by the rock because there's darkness cast by the sun. And the sorcerer Don Juan basically suggests to him, well, just what happens if you shift your perception and you perceive it as glue, like connecting the rock to this larger piece of rock. And it's just a very simple prompt, and the whole experience, because he sticks with it, he's like, I'll play with this idea, let's see what happens, completely distorts his subjective experience of what's happening. And then this book is peppered with these examples of what happens when you pay attention to the tiniest thing, like a particular pebble, and you start to see it's like the universe within a grain of sand type of thing that we might be able to relate to in English spoken literature and history. And it's kind of this quality of attention, if we permit ourselves to play and to allow these constructs to just not necessarily even fall away, but just to turn down the volume on them, what can happen in these spaces. And there's a story that you shared with me last time when we spoke, which I'd love to ask you about if you're comfortable sharing it now, which is around your experience with the cave, which kind of speaks into this otherworldly, but very much of our world experience you can tap into if you're just open enough to go there. Would you feel comfortable sharing that?
Yeah, no, I don't want to go there.
I love good stories.
Hopefully, if the audience isn't isn't up for gaslighting or anything like that.
I hope not. And if they are, then they can bugger off.
Well, it is important that I think as scientists we have to be able to open up to these other embodied experiences. And, the important thing here is that whether an experience is real is ultimately irrelevant. What's important to acknowledge is that the interpretation exists for everybody. And it's in the interpretation that dictates how our actions play out in the world. And, when I say that the experience is real is irrelevant, I think we have to be careful that it can be a personal reality, a subjective reality, but we can't necessarily then transfer that, or just because it happened to me, it happened to everybody. We have to be careful about that. But what I'm trying to say, point being is with this beautiful example you gave, there's story in that. There's a richness. There can be myth, there can be metaphor, there can be symbolism. There's a reordering of the senses we get out of our sensory ruts, in this Castaneda story. And let that be in terms of deepening a relationship to looking at the world differently. That's fine, and we don't have to then, go back and say, well, it's impossible, because it may well be, but another worldview, it may not, like it might be exist. Reality is all possibilities. And, so then I think going into that can then just give us a different interpretation. So the experience that you're referring to was a couple of weeks ago. I was walking along this coastline, and this is the coastline, where humans woke up as Homo sapiens, where we have, evidence of the first forms of creative expression, problem solving with tools, forming a kind of culture, sort of the entopic phenomena of cross hatching, using ochre, and there's rich history here from this Middle Stone Age period. And there's a beautiful walk here, the Robbo Coastal Corridor, and we were in a section where our guide, who has ancestral links to this coastline, conducted a little ritual, a little prayer. I mean, many of traditional peoples here, their belief system is an infusion of Christianity and their traditional beliefs, and they coexist with perfectly within their worlds. And we did that, and afterwards he gave a little smile and said, "This happens a lot. When I do this, there's often an animal that appears." And on this particular day, we had a humpback whale, just down down there in the bay, and it's very late in the year to see a humpback whale here, and it was sort of just milling in an area and being quite. The humpback had its flipper out and was doing some flipper slapping and moving around, and then it actually was moving sort of to the northeast, which is the wrong direction you'd be going now. You'd be going the other way. And I was also like, it's the wrong direction. But actually it did turn around, and for a short while it was just off the coast, sort of paralleling us as we're walking down the coastline. And, some of the group felt something significant, some of them didn't. But it certainly sparked a conversation with myself and the guide, because he was leaning into that sense of wonder, like, I've done this enough times now, and there's something that's flagging here for him, and for the others, for myself, I could say, well, that was a coincidence. It's lovely. It was a coincidence, but the deeper thing for me here is it sparks a bit of question around the great mystery, and particularly this alchemy of attention. What is it about focused attention? What is it about the attention of ritual, the attention of a collective focus on something, of a stillness? What does that invite from nature? It could simply be enough to say, animals pick up on vibe without a doubt. I mean, that's clear. It could be as simple as, when it's in close range, that's something I now recognize. It's not this agitated being, that it's this agitated aggression. It could be that. But obviously when it's quite far off, as this whale was, you'd be like, well, we'd sense our presence. But, there was an appearance, there was a coinciding, and it was meaningful for us. And I think it just invites a reverence, and discount that experience as you will. But going forward for me and for our guide, he has a meaning that he will continue with doing that. And he won't necessarily look every moment like, where is it now? I didn't appear. But there's like, well, I'm doing something. I'm serving consciousness. My attention is stopped here. I've invited everyone's attention for a moment of reverence. Reverence is huge at this point in time. for that relationship with nature, and let's see what emerges. And yeah, so I mean that's a meaningful nature experience. That covers a whole range of experiences, and that would definitely classify that as a meaningful nature experience. And so when I have those experiences, I also go, yeah, well, that ticked that theme and it ticked that theme, because I analyze them all quite intellectually as well. But yeah, but this, and that was, I mean, that flagged throughout my research, intentionality, particularly around ritual, ceremony, meditation. There are enough of these experiences where that flagged, and I was a theme. So yeah, I mean, the data that I collected showed that anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Very sorry, Connie, you're going to say something.
Yeah, there's just one thing. This focus. We're so into being focused, and I talk about being fragmented. And many of these self-help programs say the biggest thing people want these days is to be focused. And you're talking about this activity, and just something I wanted to flag on that. In that, again, with a hat tip to Ian McGilchrist's work here on the divided brain. But so he's spoken about this idea of the bird, which has got the narrow focus. So the left brain, which is looking for the seed and looking for that seed to that seed to that seed to that seed, and yet the right brain, which has to scan for predators, which has to have the wide open view to be aware of what's happening with the juveniles that they're caring for, and so it's important to register that there are these different types of attention, and there's different types of focus. There's narrow focus and there's broad focus. And one of the things I think we've overlooked in our rush to be focused is that we're only saying it's the narrow focus. And I'm quite into wildlife tracking, and in sort of tracking community, one of the things you would be very careful about if you're in the wild is when you start getting into narrow tracking, where you're really looking at the spore and how it's pressed and all that sort of thing. You've basically have made a statement that you are comfortable with your surrounds, that there's no dangers, and because you can only go to that level of detail once you're aware that the lion has moved on. And so narrow focus is aligned with safety, feeling safe. And one of the things that I think humanity needs to be careful of is that they're not lulling themselves into this false sense of safety with their relationship with the bigger natural world and what's going on. Because if you're incredibly focused on detail and distracted and being pulled away, and you've fallen out of relationship with what's happening, then you're not actually going to ever say there's a problem, because you don't know if the animals are returning seasonally. You don't know what you've lost, and because you're thinking, in this focused world, it's all good, but you've lost the perspective that's touching the dots and the bigger picture and all the rest.
That is fascinating, and I hadn't heard it framed in that way before. And the fact that we so prize being focused because it's connected to that particular kind of focus. It's connected to productivity, to value. Well, I say value, nominal value, financial value, predominantly, I would guess. But before we go into that sort of line of questions around, because I do want to ask you about what a post-economic paradigm could look like, which is something that we touched on last time we spoke. I want to talk a little bit more about ceremonial consciousness, and to kind of preface this, and it's not quite the same thing, but it's the thing that comes to mind, and so I think I want to name it. There's this curious thing where a lot of the time when you speak to people, if this question around or theme around ceremony comes in and whether it plays a role in our lives, most of us will, in a business context, say no, unless you say to someone, well, what about the ceremony of celebrating birthdays and Christmases and Easter? And then it's like, oh yeah, okay, fine. And so there's the connection I want to make here is that we have these kind of predetermined spaces or times where we celebrate in some sort of ceremonial way. And there seems to be a resistance and reluctance, and I notice this in myself too, because it seems I don't know what the word is, like that you might get shut down or it's not the right place or the right time. And I agree, in most business instances it's not. But there seems to be this allergy towards bringing this into conversations in workplaces, in business. And I recently gave a talk, it was earlier this autumn, at a conference. We were talking about marketing and the machine, so about AI. And I hadn't planned to go there, but I did include a video with, it was basically showing mothers and their daughters, different sets of mothers and daughters, watching social media feeds from influencers, showing the mothers what the daughters would have been seeing. So things like, this is how you lose loads of weight and file your teeth, all this really damaging advice. And then with AI, they, on this big screen, they're seeing this feed, they superimpose these messages into an avatar, which is very convincing, of the mother saying this thing to her daughter. And the mother's watching on at the image of herself projected on the screen, saying these things. And she's like, this isn't me. This is not something that I would say. All of this is to say that it gets to the end of the video and these, the soaring strings come in, the music, and there's this really moving moment where you see that the mothers, all they want to do is protect their child. And they didn't realize before the risk that they were facing. And now they're like, right, we need to do something. And it really pulls on the heartstrings. And this is just a 3-minute ad by Dove talking about beauty and mental health, by and large. And yet, when the video stopped playing, and I've tried this various different times, there is a palpable shift in the quality of attention in the room, where people have dropped into a heart space. And whether it's men, women, of different ages, different identities, or like whoever it is, there is a universality to that human story. And I would say it goes beyond human stories, that moves people into a space where it's really hard to get back into words after that. And so and I've noticed this every time I've done this, I'm like, right, how am I going to bring this back to creativity and marketing? Like and eventually I ended up talking about creativity for a while, which was kind of a gentler route in. But it's extraordinary to me how available these heartfelt spaces are that plug you into a sense of wanting to connect, of love, of protection, of joy, of meaningful experiences and relationship. If it's that easy from an ad that's 3 minutes long in a marketing conference, then there is a space for, and a hunger, I think, for ceremonial spaces where we do feel more of these qualities of relationship and meaning, and that kind of soaring feeling you get in your heart when you listen to a piece of music and then you join in and you're around a fire. So I'm curious, thinking about ceremonial consciousness as perhaps not only this grand thing that we sometimes think of it as, but as this thing that you can weave into daily life, perhaps in unexpected places. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's again, it's also a can of worms.
Yeah.
The spiritual experience is incredibly part of being human, and I also have trouble with the word spiritual because it had a lot of baggage. And it tends to be seen as being otherworldly, whereas I do believe spirituality has to still have firm roots in the earth. But I like to think of spirituality by its etymological roots, spiri, which we see in respiration, which we see in inspiration, and that it's our source of inspiration to something bigger than ourselves. And then you can take that where you want. So it's interesting that that's there, and I think it's always present. And potentially one of the dangers of channeling down the left brain way is that it gets awkward when these sorts of things are dropped in, or when we're all there for the left brain meeting, and then somebody gushes out a story, or even a moment of taking, which we've started to do in various meetings that I'm in, is that we just take a moment to arrive, to be mindful. So I guess aside from the grand ceremonial consciousness moments, it is the mindful moments. It's the mindful micro moments, and that can be a form of, I would think, mini ceremony, and something that I do, and I'm grateful to the work of John Young and many colleagues for this practice is just using a nudge from nature. Like there's a very loud bird here in South Africa called the hardy-dar. So when I hear that, and that's because how it sounds. It sounds
quite bombastic.
Yeah, I mean it's It's the bane of many people, but it's present in my area. Like, it's relatively urban, semi-urban, so you can encounter it. And when I hear that, for me, that's my nudge. That's my push notification from nature.
Yeah.
Is stop. Stop and be aware and take a breath. And which direction am I facing? What's the last sound I heard? What's my body experiencing right now? Just a range of questions, and you can mix them up, whatever you want. And that, I guess, because what I do think, and it's the same with this nature connection work, is that often we reserve nature for, we sort of put it in this mode of like, well, when I've done everything else, I'll go into nature, or I'll do that. Like, it's compartmentalized, like everything else in our life. It has a part-time role, and there it is. And it, for an ecological consciousness, we have to have this everyday experience, as I alluded to earlier. So I think those moments, those mindful micro moments throughout the day, because the key is the noticing. It's the moment to moment noticing and directing our attention to that. And but just like, many of the things we have like you have your yoga that you do sort of 3-4 days a week, but at some time of the year there's a yoga retreat, and that's when, it's a few days away, and there's a different mode of consciousness that you're entering. There's a different form of attention. It's more extended. You're going deeper, and attention has to be sustained to get to that level. And I don't think ceremonial consciousness is achieved at the level when it's just quickly tick the box, oh, we've done it, and off we go. And then, I think also with your example, what's happening in group coherence. We know now, I just sort of studied this week of research in Berlin where they were playing classical music during lockdown, and they had everyone rigged up with all these, neurophysiological devices. And there was coherence. Not the only thing that was in coherence, I think, was breathing, but many other things in terms of the galvanic skin response, those sorts of things were coming into some sort of synchrony and coherence that wouldn't have happened at random. So when you're presenting for a group like that, there's also that coming about, and that's something which can also be tapped in ethically at any time, and that's again where the ceremonial consciousness of a group, I think, is really important in terms of focusing attention. I think that, not sure if that answered your question now.
I don't know if it was more sort of an exploration than a question. There is something very interesting about the so also kind of the paying attention, the nudging. We had this morning, there's magnolia trees. I'm on a very busy street in Barcelona, in Gracia, but it's lined by magnolia trees that are quite high, and they reach my window. And I could hear, for ages, I just hear this really insistent little chirpy sound. And I'm like, where is this? It's obviously a bird. So I was like, where's this bird? And I look out, and he or she is just sat in the fork of this tree. It's a tiny little bird. It looks a bit like a sparrow in terms of shape and size, but this lime green breast. And I've not seen this bird. Sometimes, I don't know if it's the same one, but frequently there will be that colour bird that comes and sits in this branch. And it's just that I find it impossible to ignore, because it's just, I don't know, it just calls to me. And I think when you've had the kind of, when you're plugging back in through deep dives in nature, it's much harder than later to turn that signal back down. I'm not saying that we don't get, subsumed by city life, but there's a I think when you make time to plug in a more sustained way, where you can just remove some of the distractions, then coming back into city life, even things like the way I relate to pigeons is different now. And we kind of dismiss pigeons because they're extraordinary, and some of them, I mean, all of them, I'm sure, but some of them are particularly beautiful. And it's this way of seeing, of choosing how to see. And then I think making again, you're mentioning about intention at the head of our conversation, making that intentional choice not to slip back into inattention. That you can raise the baseline so that even if it's not as high as it might be if you were in an intentional week-long gathering out in the woods or whatever, that you're still noticing that sense of connection. And there's a wonderful book that I read several years ago now by Sharon Blackie called The Enchanted Life, which speaks to that. It's about choosing to live in a subjective experience of enchantment, of perceiving the world as in her terms, it's more of a mythopoetic entanglement, but like we get to decide how we experience things, as well as living in the kind of more objective reality of what's the temperature today. Like we get to choose. And I think there is something about, I'm curious about the dismissiveness with which we, and I do this still, with which we kind of just push aside the more magical moments because, I don't know, for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. So we're kind of coming towards the end of this section, but I wonder if you wanted to say anything on that, and then I'm going to ask you one more question related to your work, and then a couple of extra questions, and then we'll move into the gentle questions round, just because there's so much I want to ask you.
Sure.
Yeah. Is that all right?
Yeah. Well, the only thing I'll just say now is that you reminded me of a poem from a friend of mine, Gallio's Saints, and it's called "What Was the Moment?" And the poem goes through, was it the moment when I climbed this hill, had this view? Was it the moment when I, did all these things? And then the last line as well, I realized there never actually was a moment. It was just a choice to turn and listen, to pay attention. And I think that's a big part of it. It's every moment is a choice, and every moment is a choice of where we place our attention. And we need to mind what we attend to, because mind is what we attend to. And that's a critical thing we have to keep reminding ourselves.
Okay, so I'm going to attempt to ask this question and see if we can go for it briefly, just because it's something that I really had in mind to touch upon in the course of this conversation. Speaking about how we value life in weird countries, and this idea that you've raised previously about this post-economic paradigm, which is something that captivated my attention, and I'd love to get just maybe some headlines of what that is, because that's quite intriguing. How long have you got?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether a post-economic paradigm is almost feasible. I mean, like the word economy, if you go back to its roots then, is sort of also is, I think, comes with ecology and oikos and home, and so I think there'll always be a kind of economy. But if it's the capitalist materialist economy, then for me, what I think is flagging is a kind of economy where there's a real shift in values in terms of what is valued within a functioning community. It's certainly an economy of localization, of more autonomy in that localization. And again, you look at natural systems, and biomimicry is a beautiful reference point, and biomimicry is being inspired by the genius of nature. So coming back to the question, well, how would nature do it? How does nature operate these principles? And it's decentralized, which is one thing. And so I think I would certainly take my cues there. But then on the more people aspect, I'd also be looking at this idea of the gift economy. And increasingly in our area, we're very fortunate. More and more people are growing, more and more people are producing, and so a lot of my transactions now are actually exchanges. Yeah, and I think that's another way of where economy starts to shift. One of the biggest problems of economy is the accumulation of wealth at the moment, and where that's being accumulated. And I don't think too many people would argue the fact that it's not being accumulated in the right areas for the right goods. So and of course any economy really has to place our relationship with nature at the center of it. How is this actually helping to deepen our relationship? How is it helping to preserve our connection? And I mean, those principles have to be at the core of all this. I mean, there's a lot more to say about that, but I'll leave it there for now.
I love the idea of actually revisiting the root of the word and then thinking of economy in a more expansive way, like what that could actually mean, how we might reshape it, redefine it. Also very interesting. So last two questions for this section. you mentioned earlier ecological grief, and I'm curious how you orient yourself towards life and living and beauty and wholeness when things get really tough in your life.
Yeah, that's something that's been very personal for me in recent times, because I've certainly had my share of ecological grief, and working out how to orient it around that. Taking the time to sit in a natural space, it definitely helps, and that's a practice I've really tried to cultivate. Is just sitting and watching and observing, without a sense of being time constrained, because then I reconnect, as we were trying to do with the NatureFix initiative with this conservation organisation. Then I reconnect to the joy that's in every moment, to the beauty that is always there, to the sense that nature is always trying to flourish. That's what it does. It's always, it's always the weeds in the cracks in the pavement. Like there's something in that. There's always an abundance, always trying to come out. And I think just being in that space, just watching life do what it does and do what it's impelled to do and do what it's done for eons, it just gives me a reassurance is that, well, actually my role in this is very little, and this little epoch of humanity is actually very insignificant. I've struggled to go, how far I want to go with the idea of the surrender, completely just saying, but there is something in not being attached, as some of these Eastern traditions would have it, to really, to find a sort of non-attachment that is helpful, but without being, I've heard it used in ways that it doesn't sit well with me, where it's just like, well, non-attachment, let's just keep partying, but that's misses the core teachings of the practice, so that is still on compassion. It's compassion for all life. I mean, you do the work, you still, but there's this idea, well, my actions may not amount to anything, but at some level, and this is a story that I like to tell myself, whether it's grounded in reality or not, but, at some level in consciousness, these actions are feeding it and nourishing it. And I'd like to then think that, that's held for the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, that the norms, not just within our social constructs and our behaviors between one another, but the norms within consciousness, within attention. And, we have to be honest and realize that the science on consciousness has got to the point where we have to entertain an expanded view. There are very smart people, deep thinkers who are all in alignment that, it may not solely exist in the brain. And if it doesn't, what does that mean for how I show up every single day? What does that mean for my interactions with you, with my family? And, coming into kinship with the rest of life, moving from nature as this natural construct. I mean, I'm an ecologist and environmental scientist. That's how I was taught. But that it's not just a collection of species and things, but it's a eco-social construct. It's a family, it's kin. And this is what our Indigenous ancestors have had innately for eons.
Beautiful. Well, moving from that very expansive view to something very, very practical. It's that left brain, right brain thing again. If folks who are watching and listening want to find out more about your various wonderful projects, what are the places that you'd like them to find you?
Yeah, so the initiative that I spoke to is naturefix.life, and that's the work we're doing in terms of bringing nature connection to wellness trails and so forth. I'm also the principal scientist at the Kwendalo Institute based in South Africa, and there we're also looking at nature-inspired wellbeing, learning and education. And the project that I'm spearheading there is working with healthcare professionals to allow them to formally prescribe nature-based activities, as a complementary health solution, particularly for chronic mental health and chronic conditions. So that's kwendalo.com, Kwendal.com. And then my personal work and the research that I've alluded to over the years, that could be found at Eyes for Earth. So EYES 4 earth.org. And there's descriptions of meaningful nature experiences, connectedness with nature, stories, and so forth. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I will, of course, include all of these links in the show notes. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful exploration of so many interesting topics. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was wonderful to converse around this, and look forward to more.